Now, I want to get your Bible and turn to 2 Samuel chapter 8, where David expands his kingdom. There is a remarkable thing that David is going to do in this chapter, and the Bible doesn't go into a lot of detail about it. It tells us something about it. Of human interest, I would think we'd be very interested in this. It's not necessarily a spiritual thing, though, and the Bible puts much more emphasis on the bringing the ark to Jerusalem and David's plans to build the temple in Jerusalem and those promises than it does these earthly things. But yet this is an interesting chapter, and there is a spiritual significance to it, but it just doesn't go into as much detail as maybe we wish it would go, but about how David expands his kingdom. I want you to remember, when David first became king, he was king over one tribe, Judah, in Hebron, for 7.5 years. And then he became king over all of Israel. But he had all these enemies round about. And then one by one, he takes on these enemies and he subdues them all. And he is going to stretch his kingdom all the way from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. And he does it in this chapter. And let's see what happens with David. There's the memory verse. 2 Samuel 8 and verse 14. And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom put he garrisons, and all they of Edom became David's servants. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. That last expression, the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went, is going to be found 2 times in this chapter. Let's watch for it. Now here we begin. 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 1. And after this it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Methegama out of the hand of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines, they had been a problem to Israel since the time of the judges. You remember how they overran Israel and how that Shamgar fought against the Philistines. Later Samson, and then Samuel and Saul. But it was not until David that those Philistines were finally subdued. And we read a little more about the Philistines in the chapters to come, but nothing like what we have read. Their military threat against Israel is now reduced because of what David did. Now it says here that he took Methegama. Now there's no village called Methegama. And I'll tell you, you start looking at the commentaries and you'll read one or two and you think you know what you're talking about. And I read more this afternoon to look up some other things, and I checked this. And the more you read, the more you realize a lot of these commentaries, a lot of these commentators, they're not sure what they're talking about either. The idea that Methegama is a major city. And so some translations have put that in there. They took the major city of the Philistines. If that is the meaning of that word, then in the time of David, the major city would have been Gath. Remember Goliath of Gath? There were 5 Philistine cities, major cities of the Philistines. He took the Methegama. In other words, he took the big one and occupied that, and the others then were just subdued. Others had said, no, he took the reins of power away from them. And that's what meant by the Methegama. So when you start reading things like that, when you start reading commentaries on things like this, I know it's not all that significant, but when one tells you this and another tells you that, and then you realize they're not really sure what they're talking about. And you don't have to be on all these things. I'm sure those to whom this was originally written knew what the Methegama was. But it seems like most of them would call this the major city. So we can think of that as Gath, taking Gath. And maybe that's how he took the reins of power away from them, by taking Gath out of the hand of the Philistines. And now number 2, having subdued the Philistines, he went down to Moab. Now I want you to remember that David was a descendant of Ruth, the Moabitess. That would have been, I think, his great-grandmother, maybe great-great-grandmother, his great-grandmother. In fact, when Saul was chasing David, he had taken his parents into Moab. And there they were kept safe, taking them from Bethlehem to Moab during that time when Saul was after David. But now David goes down to Moab, and it seems he treats them very cruelly. Look what David did. He measured them with a line, casting them down to the ground, even with 2 lines measured he to put to death, and 1 full line to keep alive. So the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. It's not like he lined them up, got them in 3 lines. So everybody can get over here, get in 3 lines. And you had them up in the 3 lines. He says, okay, put those 2 lines to death. We'll save 1 line alive. That sounds kind of cruel, doesn't it? Now, we don't know why David did this. We're going to come across an expression here in a few minutes that I think redeems David somewhat in this, because it sounds so arbitrarily cruel. But it sounds to me like, when I read more of this, he could have been justified in this. David may have been taking care of Moab to do that. I can just imagine someone in Moab really causing trouble, and among the Moabites, that causing themselves the problem, and David had to go down there and take care of it. And he shows, look, I'm not going to stand for this. Line up. All right, so those 2 lines, we're going to put them to death. Now, y'all going to behave yourselves? And it may have been that the Moabites even would have rejoiced over seeing their problem taken care of here. But it does sound kind of cruel. I want you to remember, David did not build the temple because he was a shedder of blood. And here's some blood he shed in Moab. I want us to go back and forth to the map as we go through this tonight and know where we're talking about. There you see the arrows coming out of Jerusalem. That first little arrow points from Jerusalem to Gath. And that little area over there is the area where the Philistine cities were. And so David takes care of the Philistines. That second arrow, the largest arrow, points down to Moab. And so now the Philistines are subdued, and the Moabites have become his servants. Now here's what David did that was pretty amazing. David smote also Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. I'll show you where Zobah is in just a minute. And he went to recover his border at the river Euphrates. This must have been a major military campaign. And what we're going to read about Hadadezer makes us think he must have been a formidable enemy and was gaining in power up in that northern area, and David went up there and took care of that. Now, David took from him 1,000 chariots and 700 horsemen and 20,000 footmen, and David hewed all the chariot horses, but reserved of them for 100 chariots. Now, to hew the horses, that meant you went up behind them and you cut one of their tendons in their foot. They couldn't pull those chariots now. Those horses really were not much use for Lot when they had been wounded like that. So he just eliminated the threat. They have all these chariots, but they don't have any horses to pull them. He saved 100 horses for himself. But he took care of that military threat. Now watch what happens to show you how formidable this is. That is where Zoban is. Look how far to the north that is. Way north of the Sea of Galilee. And he went up to Zobah, and he eliminated that military threat. And then he extended his border of his reign from there all the way to the river Euphrates. There's something significant here. God had promised Abraham that he would have the land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And then we read in the book of Joshua that there failed not aught of any good thing that the Lord had promised unto Abraham, all came to pass. And we don't read about the Israelites taking that land and settling the land all the way to the Euphrates, but it was theirs. They could have had it. Sounds like they didn't occupy it. They'd had it for a short time. I want you to notice the words, how David recovered his border. Not just that he extended the border, he recovered the border. He went back and reclaimed that land that had been promised to Abraham and given to the Israelites under Joshua. And now it was Israel's again. And later we'll read that Solomon reigned over all that land. That's significant in that there are those that every now and then they'll come up and say, Israel is going to have to receive those promises. And it's tied up with all these premillennial ideas and such that somehow Israel's going to go back and they're going to rule over all this land because God promised they would. Well, God fulfilled that promise. He fulfilled it once under Joshua. And then he let David recover it. And then Solomon reigned over it. And then later we're going to read, if we were to continue to read through 1st and 2nd Kings, how that when the kingdom divided over southern Israel and northern Israel, that southern Israel occupied everything to the border of Egypt, and northern Israel for a third time extended their border all the way to the Euphrates. So God did keep that promise, and they did have that land. Now, to show you what a formidable thing that was, I want you to look at this. When the Syrians of Damascus came to succor Hadaezer, king of Zobah, David slew the Syrians 22,000 men. And David put garrisons in Samaria of Damascus, or Syrians of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought gifts. And there's the words. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. See if I got that. Yeah, there's Damascus. After he went up to Zobah and extended his border to the Euphrates, those Syrians came out to help Hadaezer, and David defeated the Syrians. He defeated 2 great armies in this military campaign to the north. And now the Syrians are subject unto him as well. David took the shields of gold that were on the servants of Hadaezer and brought them to Jerusalem. That tells us again how powerful and prosperous Hadaezer was in his kingdom. They had shields, and they had their shields of gold. But David was able to defeat him and take those shields of gold for himself. And then it says from Betha and from Berothai, the cities of Hadaezer, David took exceeding much brass. This was a well-equipped, well-armed army to the north of David that he was able to take his Israelite host up there to defeat with shields of gold and much brass being other material used in their armor. Chariots, horsemen, shields of gold, exceeding much brass, and the Syrians helping them, and David defeated them all with the Lord's help and extended that border. Now, when Tuai, that's an interesting name, isn't it? Tuai. Somebody said, well, he had 2 eyes. Okay, that was in our class this morning. When Tuai, king of Hamath, heard that David had smitten all the horse of Hadaezer, he was glad. Here's what it said. Then Tuai sent Joram, his son, unto King David to salute him and bless him, because he had fought against Hadaezer and smitten him. For Hadiezer had wars with Tuai, and Joram brought with him vessels of silver, and vessels of gold, and vessels of brass. Now, let me show you on the map here. There's Hamath. Hamath to the north. This Hadiezer was a threat to those nations round about him. And we have learned some things, archaeologists claim they have learned some things about Hamath, in that Hamath was a nation of the Hittites. And there was a long time where people used to mock the Bible, saying there's no such thing as Hittites. But since they have discovered a great civilization of Hittites to the north that extends over what we now call Asia Minor and Turkey, and they were a powerful people. And if Hamath was worried about Hadiezer, it just shows again how strong Hadiezer had become. And it marks again the great victory that David had. If you look down there a little south of Hamath where it says Mediterranean Sea, and off to the side of that we see the Sidonians. You remember Hiram, king of Tyre? That would have been in that area. Hiram had already made friends with David. And so here's what David has. He had subdued his enemies to the south. And he had now subdued his enemies to the north. And the other kings that were along that had aligned themselves with David and were friends with him. This set David's kingdom up as perhaps the most powerful kingdom of the Bible lands of his day. For Egypt was now subdued, and we have yet to read of the Assyrians and the Babylonians coming to power. And so David was the great, powerful king in that area. And he turned this kingdom then over to his son Solomon, who ruled over it all the days of his life. Now David took all these things and dedicated them unto the Lord, with the silver and the gold that he dedicated of all the nations which he subdued, of Syria and Moab, and of the children of Ammon, and of the Philistines, and of Amalek, and of the spoil of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. So, in dedicating them to the Lord, he didn't enrich himself with them. He didn't give them to his wives. He didn't give it to his soldiers. He didn't go out and spend it all at Dollywood. He dedicated it to the Lord. And what that means is that he took this, and that would later be used by Solomon to finance and to decorate and to build the great temple that Solomon would build in Jerusalem. Now David gat him a name when he returned from smiting of the Syrians in the Valley of Salt, being 18,000 men. The Valley of Salt was south of the Dead Sea. The Syrians were far north in Damascus. And it seems like the Syrians kind of tried to wage sort of like the Germans did in the Battle of the Bulge. They tried to come back and maybe slip around and come up with David from the south, but he met them in the Valley of Salt. And having defeated the Syrians the second time, everyone knew about David. King David had a name for himself. And hadn't God already said, I'll make thy name great among the great men of the earth? So God had done that. David, everyone knew David was a great king. And you better leave David alone. He put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom put he garrisons, and all they of Edom became David's servants. And then the second time this expression. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. Used once in the north and once now here in the south. Let's return to our map. We talked about how he had subdued Ammon. Well, there's where Ammon was. Over there we've heard of the Ammonites. And then the Valley of Salt, that arrow points from Jerusalem down to where the Valley of Salt would be. And below that is Edom. He put garrisons in Edom, and the Edomites became subject to him. And I didn't list it here, but south of Judah, you see that brook of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, and that's where the Amalekites were. And he subdued Amalek. They just stayed out in the desert. They didn't make any more raids into Israel in David's day. So David is one by one taking care of all the enemies round about. But then in verse 15 it says this: David reigned over all Israel, and David executed judgment and justice unto all his people. I want you to remember verse 15 when you look at verse 2. We had the men line up in 3 lines and say, okay, put those 2 lines to death. Why did he do it? Well, it doesn't tell us the details, but we do read later that David was executing judgment and justice, and that the Lord was with him when he was doing these things. So it seems to think that some way that maybe we don't understand, but somehow that was justified. Whatever was troubling Moab, David went down there, and by this action, he put a stop to it. And so the Moabites became his servants. Now we read about some of the men in David's administration. Joab, the son of Zeruiah. Remember, Zeruiah is David's sister. This is David's nephew. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the host. That's the army. There's a Jehoshaphat, the son of Abilad. He was the recorder. Evidently, he kept the records. We got Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar. They were the priests. Ahitub and Abiathar. 2 lines of priests coming out of the sons of Aaron, and we're going to read how the high priesthood shifted from one of those line of priests to the other as we go forward. If not in 2 Samuel, we'll see it as we get on into the Kings. And then Sariah was the scribe. The scribe was one that copied documents. You know, writing was quite a technology then, and it was expensive. You had to get the right writing materials. You had to have the right ink. And it wasn't like us. We can just take paper and just make notes, and we don't think much of it. But then it was quite a task to learn how to do this well, and then to do it with the care, to do it correctly. And so he had this scribe. They didn't have copy machines. He was the scribe, or over the scribes that were responsible for copying the documents. And the document we've seen that the scribes copied most of all was the law of Moses. But it may have also included some of the official documents of David's kingdom and the things taken down by the recorder. We read of Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. He was both over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. We were calling them the Cherethites and the Pelethites here in our class this morning, but it wasn't the Pelethites, it's the Pelethites. And who are they? Well, I thought I knew this morning. I studied some commentaries this afternoon and decided I don't know who they were. A lot of the commentaries will tell you that these are 2 of the peoples that together make up the Philistines. And so he had someone to watch out over those Philistines that had given them so much trouble. But that's not the only explanation given of who those people were. Some said they were the slingers and the throwers. So maybe they were some kind of special military squad or something that David had. But generally the commentators will say they were 2 peoples that came together that formed the Philistines. Again, that's something it's interesting, but it's not highly significant here. But then we read also of David's sons who were the chief rulers. Now that word is interesting. In Mike's Bible this morning, there was a footnote, and that word chief rulers is called priest. So I looked that up this afternoon too. And sure enough, that's a word. But then as I keep studying, the word priest is used in different ways. By context, the priest of God are those the people would go to gain access to God. You had a sacrifice to bring before the Lord, you bring it to the priest, and the priest would make that. You think of the role the prophets had. That's when God wanted to reach the people, He'd do it through the prophets. And when the people wanted to go to God, they would go through the priest. And so that priest is being one you go through to reach someone else. I speculated this morning in class, maybe they were the sons that you went through to get to David. And sure enough, I found a couple of commentators that suggested that very thing, that maybe this sons of David being the chief rulers, from the word translated chief rulers, may have been, if you want to go see David, go through his son. Go see his son, and they'll be the ones to make the way for you to get to see David. Well, now that's the end of the chapter. There's so much there that I wish I knew on how David was able to pull off these military victories. All of the enemies that they had from the time of the conquest and through the judges and the reigns and the time of Samuel and Saul. David put an end to all that, and then he reached out and stretched that kingdom far to the north, to the river Euphrates. And the Lord was with him when he did that. Okay, we've got one more Sunday to get ready for the Bible Bowl. Next Sunday night, I'm going to talk about some of the highlights of what we've seen in David's life. I'll briefly cover the first 4 chapters, but I'm going to dwell on chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. You may want to review them. We'll look at the highlights of that by way of review for us, and also by getting us ready for that Bible Bowl. So interesting, isn't it? All the things that went into God's plan, into God's mind, in preparing something better for us. And now we look at David's kingdom. We're in a better kingdom. We're in the kingdom of the Son of David, that spiritual kingdom. And we expand its borders every time someone responds to the gospel and is baptized into Christ. Do we need to expand those borders tonight? We're going to offer the invitation. If someone wants to be baptized into Christ, then they can do so this evening. And if someone has wandered astray, they can ask for the prayers of the brethren. And I tell you, here at Rockcliffe, we'll get in behind you and help you, because we want you to go to heaven with us. And we'll pray for you and help get you back on your sound spiritual feet. So, if you need to respond to the invitation, let's do it while we stand and sing.